Genesis chapter 11, and uh, and and what we have in Genesis chapter 11 is really details of some of the events that take place within chapter 10 that aren't covered. Chapter 10 gives us an overview of the nations, but chapter 11 kind of gives us more details of what happened and how those nations came to be. We'll begin reading in verse 1 and we'll go down to verse 9. Now the whole earth had the same language and the same words. And it happened as they journeyed east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and they had tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. Let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Yahweh said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. This is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there. Let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's language." So Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, Yahweh scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Having left the ark, Noah and his sons, they, of course, all spoke the same language. And so did their descendants. After all, this is how things work in our own families, isn't it? Generally speaking, we speak the same language that our parents do, and our grandparents, and our great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. Until or unless our families move to another place. Well, in the beginning, this is the way it was. After the flood, everybody in the world was descendant of Noah and his sons, and everybody spoke the same language, at least for a time. And so that's what verse 1 tells us. This is how this chapter begins. They all had the same language, literally. In the Hebrew, they were all of one lip. Literally, they were all of one set of words. That's what the Hebrew is telling us. And in the English, this is what the translation says. They had the same language. They had the same words. They were all speaking the same language. They had the same dialect. Everybody was the same. And so, as they journeyed east from where they were, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. So they traveled. Remember, the ark landed, it settled in the Ararat region, where the mountains of Ararat were. And they From there, they journeyed to find a good place and decided to settle in Shinar, which is, well, it's in the Mesopotamia area. It is that area, and I didn't think to put up a map on the screen, but it might have been a good idea. But most of us can remember from school or perhaps history that Fertile Crescent, that place between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That area must have reminded them of their homeland in the pre-flood world. And I believe that's why even secular historians and archaeologists and anthropologists, they all say that this is where is the birthplace of civilization. There's a reason for that. This is where man settled after the flood. And we can see kind of an idea of why of that happening, because they took names, Tigris and Euphrates. You remember those were names of rivers that were in the Garden of Eden. This must have been place names that were before the flood. And so these people, especially Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they would have remembered from before the flood. And they said, oh, this looked very familiar of the way things were before. So they named it after their homeland. I think I mentioned something about that happening in other instances. That's why here in America, we have place names. Like, you'll find Athens, Georgia, Athens, Ohio. People, as they come across and move to different places, they will name a city or call a place after something that reminds them of somewhere. There are certainly street names that you'll come across that'll be of another place. Even down here, you'll see an Ohio Street or a Connecticut Avenue or something like that in a city that is far removed from Ohio or Connecticut. It's because people are thinking of home, thinking of where they came from. Well, the place was very fertile, and they would have been a nice place to settle. This land of Shinar, and they would have settled there. Verse 3 says, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks, burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar. Thus begins an idea that would forever change the course of human history. Now, I mentioned Nimrod in the last lesson. Nimrod was apparently the man behind the operation. He was the leader of this. But Satan, I believe, was also playing a key role in this rebellion against God. It's very probable that Nimrod recognized the new status of man now that they'd gone beyond survival mode, having gotten off of the ark and been able to have children, and population was beginning to grow. Now it would go one of a couple different ways. One would be systematic colonization and development of all parts of the world, each with his own local government in accordance to God's command. Remember, not only in the beginning when Adam and Eve were first created, but also in chapter 9 and verse 1. If you want to go there for just a moment. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They were told to go forth and fill the earth. So if they would have done that, all the peoples of the earth would have spread across the land, and then there would have been separated governments, separated peoples, separated leaders. So that's one possibility. Had they been in obedience to God, that would have been the only possibility. But there was a second possibility which popped into his head. And this is what's being played out. And that is the establishment of a strong, centralized society which would be able to eventually control the whole world. God's ways are always the best ways. And we read these things and we think, why didn't they just obey God? And maybe we think, well, none of this is applicable to us, but beloved, don't forget that a few thousand years later, when Christ established his church, he told them to go into all the world, and yet that first church decided to hole up in Jerusalem with thousands of members. Some estimate that they may have had up to 10,000 members before persecution came to scatter them. Sometimes it enters our hearts and our minds to be hard on the people that we read about, and certainly we ought to be hard against sin, but let us not underestimate the potential that rests in our own hearts. What went on here at Babel was terrible and had terrible consequences for the rest of the world. But at the end, Yahweh God had the final say, just like he did in the New Testament when the church of Jerusalem was not obeying what he said to do. And here in this text, the end goal would be more than just ruling men, but would be a society that no longer needed God. And what they did is they began to set up a brick-making industry, a society, in a place where they didn't have rocks apparently, but they had to make bricks. These weren't brute cavemen. These were men who were genius. And they took and they began making bricks, a very ancient art. Furnace heated. Indeed, the slime that they used was plentiful and existed. We find it in the Tigris, Euphrates river valleys, even to this day. In verse 4, they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower, whose top will reach into heaven. Let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Lest they be scattered, they wanted to make for themselves a name. They wanted to make for themselves a tower whose top could reach all the way up to heaven. They wanted it to prevent themselves from being scattered. This grand tower would be the center of their religion, the center of their architecture. It would be a symbol of their unity as well as their strength. It's a picture of rebellion against God, a picture of rebellion against Yahweh. It's a picture of, if you want to think of it, a works-based religion, a way in which man can climb or crawl or work his way up to heaven. In Josephus's book, The Antiquities of the Jews, this is what he writes about it. He says, "Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means that they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers." Now, of course, we know that Josephus was not writing scripture, and he may have been exaggerating some things, but we also know that there were stories being passed down from that time. It's kind of interesting that this close to the flood, that Nimrod and those people wanted to build a tower that would reach up to the heavens. And Josephus says part of the reason was so that they could have something high enough that if God were to send a flood, they could escape it, and that they could avenge their forefathers, which were destroyed in the flood. Now, whether Josephus was hearing some story that had been passed down that was an exaggeration or not, the bottom line is this: the Bible is clear. What was happening was an outright rebellion against Yahweh. And this was not a good idea in any way, shape, or form. Now, I have no doubt that Noah and Shem had a problem with this. And I also have no doubt that Nimrod struggled to get everybody on board with the idea. I believe there was probably a remnant that had issue with this. But whatever the case may be, if there was a remnant, it was a small remnant. And it was a big enough problem that the Bible records it as a big problem. And as we see this taking place, this isn't just some story to be told in a Sunday school class as a story, like you might tell a fairy book tale. This is real stuff. In fact, Paul took this as real thing, real history. If you go to Romans chapter 1, as he gives the history of the Gentiles. We'll start there in verse 18. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the likeness of corruptible man, of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." What we see here in the history of the Gentiles is that even though they had knowledge of God, they did not retain it, and God gave them over. And what we have here in Genesis is we find a group of people who knew something of God. They came from Noah. They knew the truth of Yahweh, but they rebelled. And when they all separated, they did not like to retain knowledge of him. And what we find here is that though there are differences in the world's religion, and though there are differences in languages, they can all be traced back to Babel. To Babel. There are definite similarities in their religions. An evolutionary pantheism, a system of astrology, idolatrous practices, all of those things go back all the way through to Babel, and we can trace it back there. Well, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, Nimrod and his team, they may have thought that they were in charge. They thought that they were going to build themselves a city, a tower whose top will reach into heaven. They were going to make for themselves a name. So that they couldn't be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But they found out God is still sovereign. God is still sovereign over all things. In verse 5, it says, "Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built." God is still in control, even when men and the sons of men decide to do something. Even when the majority makes a ruling down here on earth. The majority of men, it doesn't matter. The majority is in the minority when the sovereign God steps in. Now, do not misunderstand. He did not have to step down to earth to see what was going on. Don't think of Yahweh God as being an old grandfather trying to adjust his spectacles to see what was going on earth. He knew. He knew the developments. He knew what was going on. In fact, he knew it before it was even happening. This is written after the manner of men, so that we may know he was taking notice. He came down in his power and his authority upon them and around them. You see, far too often we think of God as being way, way up yonder in the third heaven. No. He came down to see the city. He's here. The tower which the sons of men had built. We're not told how long it was before this happened, but we can assume that it may have been a while. Our God is long-suffering. He's patient, even in the Old Testament, but we see it today. Look at our own country. How long has it been that this country has been allowed to, permitted to? How long has God been long-suffering to us as a nation while we have, as a nation, murdered the unborn? How long will he be patient and long-suffering while we allow, permit, and even celebrate same-sex marriage? Are we not, as a nation, as rebellious as they were? Maybe more so. But beloved, Judgment Day is coming. Judgment is coming. And while he may not visit us in his wrath yet, do not think that his silence or his long-suffering is his stamp of approval. God is not happy with America. I can guarantee you that. Same goes for any nation. Whether it's a Muslim nation, or a Jewish nation, or a communist nation who rebels against God and his word. Verse 6, Yahweh said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. This is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. The problem lay in the unity of the people. It's kind of interesting how differently God sees the world than the way man does. Sure, in John chapter 17, Jesus prayed for unity of his people. And we ought to want the same. But unity in rebellion to God? No. The United Nations? It's a terrible thing. A terrible thing. Ecumenical movements? Horrible. the New World Order, run from it. As one preacher said one time, it doesn't matter how clever the arrangement, a bunch of rotten eggs will never make a good omelet. And when they're joined in rebellion to God and His Word, it's not a good thing. The end will never be good. It's never going to be good. Maybe somebody said, well, I know this Nimrod guy, he's not the best in the world, but he's getting a city built. I'll join hand in hand with him. Be careful. Be careful who you join with. Be careful. God says nothing. Nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Now, God wasn't up in heaven wringing His hands together saying, what should we do? No. Verse 7 says, come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's language. You see there in your Legacy Standard Bible, you'll notice that us is capitalized. Preacher said one time, if you try to explain the Trinity, you might lose your mind. If you try to explain the Trinity away, you'll lose your soul. I don't understand everything there is about the Trinity, but I understand He is who He says He is. And back here yonder, when the Tower of Babel was going on, the triune God that we serve, the God of the Bible, Yahweh God, had a council. And it's just like it says it is, that it happened the way that He said it is. Come, let us go down. And then what happened? So Yahweh scattered them. He confused their languages. Who was involved in this? God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. There was a miracle that took place that day. Evolutionary teaching has struggled with language. It's what sets us apart from the animals. But being able to trace one language to another has been difficult for the evolutionist. The answer is right here in the Bible. A miracle took place. 8 people got off of the ark speaking the same language. They had children, and their children had children, and eventually there was enough people, and they began to build a city and a tower to get all the way up to heaven, and Yahweh God said no. And with great ease, with great ease, He stopped that building project. Verse 8 says, so Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. With great ease, our God wrought confusion of his enemies, and he made them desist from their purpose. Presumably, individual families could still understand each other. But oh, imagine the scene at that building project. Everyone was talking, but nobody could understand each other. Some would think that others were mocking them. A foreman would be irritated that his crew was no longer obeying orders. Workmen might imagine that their bosses were making sport of them to make them look bad. Nimrod would think that, well, Nimrod himself, he would have been affected because his servants would not be doing something when he told them to do it, so they would no longer obey. That might have angered him, but not so much as when he ordered his servants to be punished, but then those he instructed to carry out the punishment wouldn't have obeyed him. Loud, incoherent arguments would have erupted all over the building site and throughout the city. Full-fledged chaos was everywhere. And so nothing was left to do except to pack up and leave. And each family group would have left and eventually become tribes, nations, and cultures. Now, they had nothing left to do but to obey the commandment to fill the earth. Verse 9, therefore, its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The word Babel is a word that means to confuse. From this account, Israel first understood not only how so many nations, peoples, and languages came about, but also the rebellious origins of their enemy, Babylon. Because they would not fill the earth as God had commanded them, God confused their language so that they had to separate, collecting regions where their own language could be spoken. So we read this, we read it, and we look at it with great interest. As I've said, the Bible is not a history book, but it is true when it speaks of history. But ultimately, we ought to see the sovereignty of God over men. And as we look around the world, look at the world around us, we see evidences of the separations of languages, the separations of people. But can we have any clue as to what the Tower of Babel may have looked like? Is there any evidence in archaeology as to what the tower may have looked like? Well, we certainly can think about these things. And through the years, there have been many guesses, there have been many clues. In the Renaissance period, especially the 1500s, 1600s, there were a lot of paintings and pictures. Some of y'all may be familiar with some of these. They're in some old Bibles and pictures. Peter Bruegel painted this one, 1563. You see the details there. Pretty creative looking painting. This was his artistic kind of the way he thought that the Tower of Babel may have looked like. Cornelius Anthonis, 1547, drew this one. This is the destruction of the Tower of Babel, 1547. And you see the way that he drew this, we can see kind of the influence of maybe where he came from. He was coming from Europe, so there's some European type architecture there in the picture. Lucas von Valkenburg, 1568. That's what he thought maybe the tower might have looked like. Each one of these, they kind of pictured a tower with some windows, or certainly they got the upward movement going correctly. The question is that we ask ourselves: are these paintings, are they accurate, or are they imagination? Well, the original Tower of Babel was destroyed, but around the world there are some places that may give us an idea. As you can imagine, as these people scattered from the Tower of Babel, as Paul put it, they didn't keep the knowledge of Yahweh, the knowledge of God. But what they did do is they kept the pagan imaginations. And so there are structures you find all over the world. Uh-oh. And now, there we go. Let's see. There's a ziggurat in the Yucatan in Mexico. Very early on in Mexican history. Very similar kind of structure found in present-day Iraq. You see these very tall structures that the ancients were building. In Iran, another tall structure that was built. Mayan ruins in in Central America. Another very tall structure that was built. Familiar with the pyramids of Egypt? This was one of the earliest pyramids, which was a ziggurat, which is similar to what was in Mexico and the Americas, similar to what was in modern Iraq. Not everybody knows, but there are also pyramids in China. Chinese pyramids, also very similar. The ancient Chinese built similar structures. And then, of course, here in America, the mound builders, the Mississippian culture, they built structures going up to the heavens. Answers in Genesis, artist drew that, which is what their artist thinks maybe the Tower of Babel looked like. What am I trying to say? Well, we don't know exactly what the Tower of Babel looked like, but we do know that as these people groups separated from Babel, some of them would have retained information of the building project. So you think about this. If if they were, if something like this was happening in our modern day at a Ford assembly plant, and these people were all working together to build a Ford F-150, and then all of a sudden the crew was separated by language, and they were divided out over the world. Only some of the people groups that were separated would know enough to be able to replicate that Ford pickup truck. Others, of course, wouldn't be able to do it. And so that's why there are some people groups, some countries, some primitive tribes and peoples who weren't as advanced as the Egyptians or as the Mayans and as some of the others that we saw there, but they were all building very similar structures. The atheists, as they try to study these things, they try to figure out why in the world were they all building the same things on different continents. I personally believe it's because they all came from the same place. They came from the Tower of Babel. And this was all part of their ancestor worship, part of their memories that they got told and stories that were passed down, part of their pagan worship. And these building projects that emerged across the ancient world, all similar in structure on different continents. We don't need that sort of thing to prove the Bible is true, but when it does show up, it makes me smile, because it does. It doesn't contradict the Bible, but rather it shows us that the Bible is the accurate history of the world. The answer's here. And when these guys scratch their heads and they say, what's going on? We can tell them, hey, I can tell you it's right here in Genesis. We'll go ahead and stop there. And I trust this has been a blessing and maybe some things to think about. But do we have any questions before we close out? All right. Brother Barry, will you go ahead and start us out with prayer, and then Isaiah, and then I'll close.